Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Doomer Optimism podcast. Jason and I are here today with Bex and Gabe. Those are not the names you know them by, so I'm going to let them introduce themselves, say their online handles. We can start by just doing mini introductions of who you are, whatever you want to share, and then we'll get into a conversation about psychology, spirituality, all things fun. So Bex, you go first.
I'm Bex, and most people know me on Twitter as Buhddi or embryosophy. And I love when people call me any of these things.
And embryosophy, just briefly, what does that mean? I know I could get Big Buddhi, but I don't know what embryosophy is.
Try to be brief. I've been writing a thread too, like an embryosophy readme that I keep. I'm bad at writing long threads. I write them forever and never post them. And so that's sort of the story of my life. So embryosophy is like, so I study developmental movement, which starts with conception. And we look at how cellularly we move through patterns that underpin what later become structures, which underpin what later become psycho-emotional structures. So embryosophy is something like cognition starts with movement, and the earliest movements we do are in our tissues. It's how we make ourselves or grow ourselves. And I'm incredibly interested in how those like first principles inform everything we are and do.
I love that so much. Yeah, we're definitely gonna be interrogating you about that. Okay, Gabe, you're up.
Hey, my name's Gabe, and I'm Vivid Void on Twitter, and I'm the crazy cartoon-eyed tiger who shit posts about meditation and spirituality. Yeah, that's me.
Okay, so let's start this conversation talking a little bit about our own spiritual journeys or our journeys into spirituality. I want to let one of you guys go first. Maybe let's let Jason go because he's talked about this before and he probably can easily come up with a quick arc. And then you guys can go and then I'll go. I find it useful to start by talking about narrative because it's helpful for people, I think, to think not just about like the principles of spirituality, but how do people actually come to it in their lives. So Jason, you start us off and then let these guys go.
Well, quick arc. I was raised in two different religions. One around the Native American church, the other the Baha'i faith. They've both been a big part of my life at various points. I was a very serious Baha'i for my 20s, like at the point where I was like knocking on doors, telling people about the good news. I was a believer. At some point, I kind of fell out of that, became kind of disenchanted, became very skeptical, was influenced by new atheists and all those bozos. Became just kind of, whatever. And at a certain point, I started getting back interested in consciousness. Consciousness is one of those things that just never seems to go away. It never seems to explain itself materially. So I became very interested in consciousness, back interested in things like psychedelics, meditation, really interested in pragmatic dharma, was doing a lot of meditation for a while. I kind of developed my own system, which I've written about, kind of a mixture of self-inquiry and vipassana. Got more and more interested in the embodiment aspects, embodied cognition, fit well with an activist philosophy, which I'm still fascinated by. I think it's very explanatory, and then that kind of led me to now more of a situated cognition and ecological kind of spirituality, and part of being on a homestead is about interacting, with the landscape, being part of the landscape, being of the landscape. And so it's kind of, it's like a, it fits well with kind of a non-dual sensibility, but a very active one, one that's always changing, goes through cycles. There's always something transcendent lingering in the background, but it's always, it's always transforming, it's always growing, it's always dying. So that's where I'm now.
Cool. Which one of you guys want to go next? Don't be shy. Come on. Bex, you go.
Okay, thanks. So I was raised Christian, and my parents are very devout, but are Episcopalian. So there's a certain kind of, I think, questioning, or there's still a kind of intellectuality to that denomination that that feels close to home, even though don't identify as Christian anymore. And but I can really, I'm in a place where I'm really like reintegrating that as after rejecting it and questioning it, rejecting it, and then thinking I was done rejecting it, but going through layers of that, I feel like I'm now really in a place where I'm getting to integrate it. And some of that is being on Twitter and seeing other people re-engage with that faith. But it still feels important as part of my origin story that I was raised in a household that was very Christian, but also very scientific. My dad is still alive, but retired, so was a chemist. And so I can see how, and he saw no quarrel between science and religion. It's very sweet how now, in my work, when I talk to him especially, I can see how integrated he is and how science and spirituality merge for him. And that's really true about me. Maybe it's because Father's Day is coming up this weekend. I'm like really tripping on that hard right now. So I was raised in that environment and was also a dancer from a young age. Like I call it the suburban canon, but I did like the tap, jazz, ballet, and eventually like point lyrical hip hop thing that a lot of kids kind of raised in suburbia who dance do. And so that was so important to me. I know now I have language for it to say like I'm a kinesthetic learner. Like I think kids now would maybe call it neurodivergent and things like that. But I can look back and see how I have always learned through movement that like not just enhances my ability to learn. I don't know how to learn if I'm not moving, which sometimes makes book learning hard. And so all of those pieces led me to start doing yoga in high school. I think at first I was drawn to it in a really kind of esoteric way. I liked the subtle anatomy. I thought the chakras were beautiful. I thought it seemed esoteric and cool. I was also into magic and was never really a Crowleyan, but through sort of the way like the occult and sort of yoga and theosophy intertwine, that also sort of reinforced me being into yoga. And so so all of those were part of my life in a way that felt disintegrated until I had my first psychedelic experience in college. And that somehow in that moment helped me understand how it all like worked together as sort of all of the things that influence who I am. And I started doing yoga more after college. And when I really committed regularly, this is a thing I think I've tweeted about, and I might have talked about it elsewhere, but I had this kind of what I consider kind of an awakening experience, or I like to call it like an expansion experience, but where I suddenly, like it really felt like the breath work in class and moving intentionally and learning to pay attention in a new way. I lived in New York at the time, and I was walking by the Black Cube at Astor Place, which I like to call the Hypercube. And it's where all the disaffected youth kind of hang out, where if I had grown up there, I would have wanted to be like a kind of like grumpy mall goth hanging out at the Cube. But anyway, I was like walking by the Cube and suddenly I felt like I got like bigger. and in that moment, I had this realization that though I started talking about the wonderful things about how I was raised, I was also raised with like really rigid ideas about who one is and who one can be in a very kind of normie way. And I suddenly was like, I can be anything I want. I can change. I'm plastic. I'm neuroplastic. I had like all in a moment, I felt how mutable I was. And like some would say, depending on the tradition you're coming from, how empty I was. And I felt full of possibility in that moment. And then since have pursued yoga and meditation and somatics, and we'll loop around to that again in a minute.
Cool. Gabe, you're up.
Okay. I grew up in a religious community, actually, that was it's called People of Praise. It's a community of charismatic Catholics, the same one that the Supreme Court Justice Amy Barrett Coney comes from, or Amy Coney Barrett. I don't know her; she's a little older than me, but that's where I grew up. I was Catholic till I was 20, and then I spent some, and I had a crisis of faith around that time, and also spent some time with the New Atheists, as same as Jason. I shortly thereafter joined another cult-like organization with the Marines. I was in that for 7 years, and it really is a warrior cult in many ways, and it provided a lot of the same environment for me. And then when I got out of that, I really was very lost and needed some help. I went and saw a therapist and discovered a developmental trauma that was really holding me back and making me miserable in a lot of ways. And I spent about 2 years working through that and did a lot of Zen meditation, a lot of confession, a lot of disclosure, and a lot of exposure therapy. And in the course of that, I was able to heal that trauma and patch myself up, and I think I took about 6 months off, and I loved my therapist. I thought he was great. I was telling you guys before the show started. He was this 6'4", wore a utility kilt to therapy. He was like a ranger at Burning Man. He was just a super interesting individual. And about 6 months after I'd sort of officially healed my diagnosis, I went back and I was like, there's a lot more that I want to work on, but it's in the realm of meditation. It's in the realm of I want to seek enlightenment. And he was like, well, if you want to keep coming back, then we can look together if you want. And I was like, cool. So we spent like 4 years in a kind of doing informal psychoanalysis that was informed by cognitive behavioral therapy. So we would do like open, free association, and then sort of he would help me relate those to behavioral loops in my life and the ways that that behavior created cognition and the ways that cognition created behavior. And I had this extraordinary experience while paying extremely close attention to this process that I was that which programmed the behavior, programmed the loops, and that you could program loops that weren't true to you, and you could program loops that were exceedingly true to you. And so I made the joke again. I'm the only person I know who had a spiritual awakening via Skinner style behaviorism, but I really did, and I did not achieve enlightenment through my work with him, but I got to a point where I was ready to take over and do the rest of the work on my own. Like I realized, this is the journey. I'm ready to go, and that was January 2020. And I think probably the last piece that's really salient to my spiritual journey was the pandemic happening. And the pandemic really burned away everything in my life that wasn't meaningful, that wasn't really meaningful, and that wasn't built to last in as much as anything does. And it included some extraordinarily painful losses, and also in some ways saved me from some kind of awful fates. But more than anything, it despite the costs, it opened up the space for me to leave many old ways of being behind, and to decide to finally just full-time be the person, just full-time live in the truth as I understand it. And I'm sorry it had to come at such a terrible cost, but maybe it always does.
Yeah.
And yeah, it was right around that time I got on Twitter, and I found all you guys. So
It is weird that Twitter has become this like meeting place too, and like actual place in people's journey in their lives. But it is like really cool to find, you know, these fellow weirdos. So my journey is,
I was gonna
sorry,
say
go ahead.
something. I was like, you gotta go.
No, I'm gonna go. Okay, so I have never talked about religion or spirituality in any depth here or anywhere publicly, I don't think. But I grew up in a Lutheran church, in a primarily Catholic neighborhood in Chicago. And then I went to an all-girls Catholic high school, which I loved, actually. We wore uniforms. It was like a giant school. And we had these spiritual retreats every year. And they got like increasing intensity over the course of the 4 years. So like the first one was, you know, like we just had a during the school day get together, and we did things like, okay, there's 50 people at the retreat, 10 of them stand up and the other 40 close their eyes and put their heads down, and the 10 of them are instructed, if you think somebody in this room is funny, tap them on the shoulder, and you would like get a certain number of taps, and you're like, oh, people think I'm funny, that kind of thing, like where you're just like, oh, this is so nice for like 14-year-olds to feel like how people think about them, whatever. And then senior year, so they were like increasing intensity like that, and then senior year there was this retreat called Kairos, which was built on this Jesuit practice, I guess. I have never even researched it, like, you know, it's just like one of those things you learn about as a teenager and just kind of go along with it. And I never really like looked into the history of it, why they did it this way. But the retreat was a weekend long retreat. You were not allowed to know what it was, and nobody would tell you, which was an insane feat for like teenage girls to not tell you what something was. And so nobody knew. It was completely secretive going in. And when you got there, it was set up, it was like maybe 100 girls went each time. And it was set up and you got assigned to a small group, and they would speak. There was small group leaders who were other girls in the class, who were elected by previous small group leaders. And they would talk on topics like family, on love, on like forgiveness. And they would tell their stories in front of the group of 100 people. They would say like, I had to learn to forgive my dad for being an alcoholic or something like that. And there was this idea of like, whatever you're talking about there is completely secret, never leaves the place. And then you would go into small group, and in the smaller group would reflect on this theme of like forgiveness. You know, who have you had to forgive? And then you journal about it. And then at the end of the retreat, I'm getting chills just talking about this. At the end of the retreat, you got a package of letters from everyone in your family and everyone who you've ever known, like all of your friends, and your family knows to do this. Like it's a secret in the community, but you don't know that you're going to get it. And then you get it and they're just like, you know, you're 17 or 18 years old and it's like, we're so proud of you. This is who you've become. Like, like start crying. It's so beautiful. And then when you get back, you also don't know. It's like Sunday night, you know, there's school the next day. All of your friends and family come, and everybody's friends and family come to the gym, and you get received back into the community. And everyone who was there has to stand up in front of the mic and like, I think say like something they learned or something like that. And you keep it vague. And then like, you know, you go sit with your family or whatever, and like embrace them for the first time after this experience. That was super formative for me. Like, I mean, just thinking about how you can use psychology and communication to just like build relationships and community and friendships. How there's like an importance of rituals and rituals that people are bought into and like all participating in. And so that wasn't to me like it necessarily had to be Catholic or anything. And I hadn't ever heard of that like happening in any other Catholic place besides our little neighborhood where all the Catholic high schools did that. But then I kind of was just like loosely atheist, went to college where it was like cool to be not religious at all. It was just understood that if you're intelligent, you are not religious. That's like the kind of attitude that they took, which I think is kind of harmful in general, because there's no real talk of spirituality either. It's just like, there's just no religion or spirituality to discuss. It's all intellectual stuff. And then after college, I just started, I took psychedelics a couple times, and that really helped me to, at the same time as learning about like, I had a real interest in Paleolithic consciousness and just like, taking psychedelics and like learning about Paleolithic consciousness, I was just like, I think our probably natural state for spirituality is some kind of, base animism, where just like everything is filled with magic, just like a total sense of like the world is just magical. And so then, I've read about all various religions. And for me, like my understanding is that like at its base, a lot of religions, especially the mystical side of them, is really just like trying to get your consciousness to that magic, that sense of like everything is imbued with meaning. So I just, I think basically like my very loose and relaxed spiritual practices revolve around trying to get that presence, the be here now, just magic of daily life. And I think it's just like in a Buddhist sense, just very transitory. Like you get it for a second, you get it for like a minute, you get it like in a flow state, and then it goes away. And that's just our burden to bear as humans. I don't know. So then anyways, that's my little story. That's where I'm at now. And what I'm reminded of with all of us talking is like the kind of mix of so many different influences, but we've all kind of come to a similar sense of like embodiedness matters and like this cognition to behavior cycle. So I don't know if people have, I don't know. I just want to explore that more. I'm like, hear thoughts about that.
For me, it really came when I had this issue. I still do to some degree, where my mind kind of fixates on irrelevant things, well, seemingly irrelevant things. And I kind of get stuck in these mental loops. And one thing I noticed is that even when that was happening, I could be doing something. I noticed that there was still some kind of awareness of like what was like, I felt confused, but there was some kind of awareness of what was real. And it was just always kind of self-sustaining. And I got really fascinated by this idea of just kind of knowing without thinking, right? Knowing outside of the formal deductive, thinking process. And I was like, what is that, right? Like where does that come from? And at some point I got a sense, or I read about it or something, that, it's related to the body. It's related to, your body kind of like just driving down the street. I do these experiments, like just driving down the street, and like, I'm not thinking about it. And I just observe my body, turning when it needs to turn. And it's like, who's doing that, right? Who is the self that's doing that? Right. And that just became fascinating. And so, I was also really interested in this Buddhist idea of no self. And it was like, but even when the self seems to, disappear for a while, there's still knowing, a self-sustaining knowing. As Robert Ray says, there is knowing. It's just there. And that, I think, really led me into kind of like, there's something about our body, this embodied cognition, that just knows. And Yeah, I mean, and that, you know, when I kind of had that insight, like it was just like, wow, this is a whole world, right? Of like being able to tap into this kind of self-sustaining knowing outside of this, you know, rationalist thinking process. And so I think, you know, the rest is history from there for me.
Anything come up for you guys, Bex or Gabe?
A lot. I'm trying to kind of narrow it down, but I want to say that what you say, Jason, is really resonant. Actually, before I say that, I want to say, wow, like Ashley, the experience you had as a teenager in, did you say it was called Kairos?
Kairos, yeah, which is like,
incredible.
Yeah, God's time, and there's like Chronos is like human time, and then Kairos.
Okay, right, gotcha. No, it sounds fucking incredible, and I just think, in some kind of way, like how different would everything be if, whatever the context, if like young people could have those kinds of experiences together and in learning together and sharing and being vulnerable. But what I was going to say to what you said, Jason, is, yeah, I agree. And I experienced myself, I think, similarly. And that's some of what I'm getting at when I'm talking about like the cellular awareness that underpins whatever we are now, which is still cellular awareness. And I mean, it's a great mystery to me that there's a part of me that thinks I'm me and like it can talk to you all and use language, and that the rest of me is in constant like embedded communication all the time that I can't manage. It would be worse if I did try to manage it. It is sort of like self-managing and emergent in every moment. And I think, or at least the language I have for it now, and one could get more granular. I'm like trying to ignore, I'm just going to say I ignore things like, not totally, but I ignore quantum physics, for instance, because that's almost like another like fractal scale levels. I don't know if I can even quite go there yet, but I would say cellularly, I think of our cells as our first sense organs, and our first senses of self is the sort of like the unit of the cell. And I think that is still under everything.
Gabe, anything for you?
A little bit. Something that's been very interesting to me. So Bex brought up rationality, or maybe rationalism, or whatever that might be, which is the way I found my way to you all, was through the post-rationalists, which is this tongue-in-cheek thing, and the rationalists being a kind of subgroup of mostly tech people in San Francisco who sort of have are doing their best to learn to think in a way without bias or without scientific error. And I actually think they've got a fascinating project. I think it's sort of teeters over into intellectualization on a regular basis, sort of as a defense against like anxiety. But I'm really interested in it because there's something really emblematic of the pole of the mind that you can really clearly put into dialectic with the pole of the body. And I'm really interested in this because I find that very often most of the people I know, and this includes some of the most aware and alive spiritual practitioners that I know, oscillate back and forth just too wildly. Either it's all body and it's no mind, and it's, everything is somatic, everything is embodied, and the mind doesn't matter, and blah blah blah. Or somebody's like hyper rational and they're like, everything needs to be, right angles, and we're going to get everything perfectly without bias. It's going to be the truth as we know it objectively. And I mean, to me, it's like, what's a lot more interesting of a question than like which one is right is like, how do these two relate to one another, and like in what ways, like when these two talk to one another and the tension between these two poles, like what happens there.
Wasn't it you who just posted a picture where it was like, I'm in the comfy zone? Was that you?
Yeah, yeah.
What were the two polls of
every
that one?
the poll on one side was everything is enchanted and approaching insanity, and then the other side was nothing is nothing is magical and it's approaching depression. So it's like too much acceptance on one side, too much enchantment on the other side. Yeah, and I'm always looking for the dialectic because there are errors that being overly somatized can lead you into, and there are errors that being like overly mind focused and overly cognition focused can lead you into. If either one is leading you away from a harmonious relationship between the two of them, yeah. You're gonna struggle. Like the state of integrity is how the truth of who you are, whatever that may be, it emerges more and more. And so I'm always looking for how that integrity is changing shape and co-constructing and co-developing.
I love that so much. Something that's coming up for me is I love this comfy zone thing. I love a comfy zone. I just love that phrase. And I love that this is, okay, so there's multiple polls coming up here. There's like free will and determinism, like are we our bodies, are we our cells, or are we some kind of consciousness? Do we have control over things or don't we, like Jason with the driving? This is a common one, this conversation about the driving, where you're like, how did my body know how to do this? I wasn't paying attention, now I reached my destination. Doomer optimism, you don't want to be too doomer, you don't want to be too optimism, like living in that. I don't know, it's just a prompt. Like these polls, it's so hard because I think it's really comfortable for a lot of people to go to a poll, or they think if they go to one of the polls that like they'll be able to control everything, and like, all right, I'm just gonna go all the way doom, I'm gonna buy into doom, I'm gonna go hardcore accelerationist, like that'll solve all the problems. And then it doesn't, because more complicated things come up. So like every time it's like the false promise of one of the polls. You got to stay in the comfy zone, but it's hard. It's like hard work to stay in the comfy zone, and it's like requires a great deal of nuance.
I like the comfy zone is really uncomfortable. But I'm the most comfortable with that. Like, I don't know. I'm suspicious of anything that's too comfortable, and maybe of anything that's too uncomfortable. I don't know, but if that even makes any sense. Yeah. But yeah, no, I definitely like see that in each of you, and I know myself to be a person who really kind of likes to surf in the, like I'm often trying to swing the pendulum towards body, because I still feel like that's not, I see people maybe writing it off or disengaging it. It's also kind of my life's work as a like somaticist, but I also always want to be clear to people, and like, and actually Gabe and I were talking the other day, and you said like one of the most complimentary things that anyone has ever said to me. I think you maybe called me post-synthesis or something, meaning like in dialectics.
Post-dialectic.
Post-dialectic is what you said. I made it into like post-synthesis, but I love that, and I want to keep figuring out what that even means. And yeah, for me, there's really something in it about, like I'm in a project of trying to redefine cognition, and this might be like ecological cognition or like situated cognition, but really being like it's not it body and mind, or like and spirit or mind or whatever, like this where words break down are so infinitely braided that they're not separable. And like, what is it to live in all of both, or all, like what does that look like?
One practice that I really like, I call it like bottom up and top down exploration of body mind is, so like bottom up is, I pay attention to bodily sensations, like a body scan. And then I notice, certain whatever knots or tensions in the body. And then I try and notice what thoughts arise when I put my attention on that, right? And then the top down form is, I'm thinking about something, and then I try and notice what part of my body is that, correlated with, or is that related to, right? And so just kind of this iteration going back and forth. I mean, one, for me, it tells me that it's continuous, right? I don't think body and mind are discrete entities. And braided, I really like that term braided. That seems to make a lot of sense. But I think one way to put it, to sell, say, a rationalist, is that doing body work, the somatics, can actually help you think a lot better, because I see our thoughts as highly related to kind of the energy structure in our body, right? And if there's some kind of constriction, it actually constricts where our thoughts can go, right? Because if something's like traumatizing, our thoughts are not going to go there. They're going to stay away. And so we're actually on a local maximum. Like if you look at that, like that, the evolutionary graph or whatever, you're on a local optimum, right? And you're actually closed off from exploring, greater potentials of your mind by doing this body work, opening up these channels that allow your thinking process to take new shapes, to be more creative.
Yeah, I think that's wonderful.
Yeah, sorry.
No, I didn't. Yeah, there's what it reminds me of is there's sort of, you see a lot sort of in our crew, there's a lot of sort of there's a lot of people who are really into self-improvement, and there's a lot of people who are really skeptical of self-improvement. Like, how could you possibly do that? That's ridiculous, and I think a lot of times, I think there's in the same way that it's sort of, you can really help someone who's sort of over intellectualizes by incentivizing them. Like, you can intellectualize even better if you get in touch with your body, and it's because it's true, and it's just going to help them holistically. You're not lying to them in any way, right? But it's like leading someone toward balance will actually make them better at the thing that they're overly optimized for. And in a strange way, it's the same thing with it's like I have friends who are like self-improvement, come on, that's not possible, all of it is waste, it's all they're Augustinian, it's all straw, whatever. And it's no, if you get people to self-improve until they hit the point, right? Self-improvement, you can't skip it. You can't jump around this part of the phase where you get to a point where you go I've really discovered enough about myself now that I no longer need to do that. You can't just skip it and be to hell with it, I know everything I need to know about myself. And you're still going to be stuck in all the things that you needed to shed by putting all that effort in, So it's I think the balancing, I think sometimes you have to what looks like you need to step on the brake is you actually need to hit the gas.
Yeah, one thing that's coming up for me is I have a little bit of I don't know, I struggle with self-improvement being on the spectrum of narcissistic, insofar as you're looking into yourself, you're spending so much time. There's if you go too far in that direction, it turns into this self-care fetishization thing. And then a couple of times I've done psychedelics, and I've when I've had since becoming a mother, and I've had my kids go with a grandparent, which is good for them. It's good for me to have my time. It's good for me to explore my spiritual practice. But then I'm on psychedelics and trying to learn, gain some sort of insight, and then I just think at the end, I just want to get back to my kids. I want to get back into the responsibility of interdependence and my role in that. And then thinking back to this Kairos experience, I think a lot of my thoughts about spirituality are about community and interdependence. Self-care should be ideally co-created. It got co-created in that experience. It wasn't just me journaling by myself. It was because it was shared that it was so powerful. So I don't know if you guys have thoughts about that.
I mean, for me, on the one hand, I do think self-care is important, or at least has been important culturally for people to recognize. but I would say an atomized culture would call it self-care.
Yeah.
There's also something like really real in my experience in like psychology and therapy, and in my experience in somatics, and those are like not separate, about learning to take care of ourselves so we can take care of the community in a way where that's not separate. I do think the self-care piece and of course like an industry built around it is pretty fappy and like annoying, frankly, even if I do think that at its fundament it's recognizing something important. And I agree with you that like self-care in and of itself, I mean, sometimes maybe we do need to, I don't know, like just take a fragrant bath. I don't know, so the word self-care conjures up a lot of kind of silly, I don't know, silly images that would make it
something, yeah.
That I would try to get like sold to me on Instagram, and I'd be like, so, but I really think at its heart, whatever self-care is getting at is, us taking care of ourselves so we can be better for others, and that those things are like not separate. And it sometimes means learning about ourselves so that we can be in community better because we know ourselves better.
Yeah, that resonates with me. I think like it's just an inherent skepticism too, and I think there's probably, I'm blaming the self-care when what's actually happening is we're in such an atomized society that like to stop the bleeding, we just like, I just got to figure this out. Like if I have to go to professional, whatever it takes, like, of course, ideally we're in a community where we're always doing self-care all the time, and we're all taking care of each other, and we're like all aware that somebody needs something and we're supportive of that, but not everybody most people don't have something like that. So it's like a solution to a larger social problem, not something to critique on its own, I think.
Well, I think it's important to critique it. I think it's important to critique it. It's become such a visible cultural concept that to not critique it is a greater sin, I think. So keep it up. I think that's important.
Okay. Well, and then the other thing that comes up a lot in Doomer Optimism, well, I think about this a lot. Okay, so in Doomer Optimism, a lot of times we talk about like, okay, so start by just like getting things right with yourself to the extent you can, like fortifying yourself, making yourself stronger, more psychologically healthy, physically healthy, whatever. And it's like the Jordan Peterson clean your room thing. Like we've talked to people who have literally said like, they listen to Jordan Peterson clean your room, type videos, and then reading the comments where people are saying like, I just needed somebody to say this to me, and then just like crying. I just needed somebody to say this to me, like, which is huge. Like, I don't want to discount that. That's such a huge step. You have to just like get to a point where like, I think I just need to be told I have agency. And then you can start moving in a direction towards something more positive. But then we always try to encourage like, okay, beyond the individual, now what are you doing with it? Are you improving your relationships? Like, are you doing anything to your community? Are you making any relationship to the land? Like, what are you changing your vocation? Like, ideally the spheres increase, they continue to increase out. And I think I'm a little skeptical of like, I think somebody who maybe, although this is like a heuristic in history too, but like somebody whose whole life is just only like enlightenment, like just and that's like a monk, and that's fine. I guess there's a heuristic for that, but it seems to me like we have a responsibility like beyond this self, to share the insights into some sort of interdependent whole.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. But I even reinterpret things like the Bodhisattva vow from Buddhism as being like, not like I'm enlightened, but I'm not going to be enlightened so everyone else can be because I have to help them. I think that's a misinterpretation, and something more like, I literally cannot be enlightened if everyone else isn't. And all the ways I could also restate that, because we can't do it alone because we're not alone. So I do think it's that, that sometimes those are just kind of misinterpretations in a really atomized world. that I think we're all in this conversation is evidence of the way there's like a really beautiful kind of relearning or remembering of things that have been forgotten.
There's a great Kenneth Folk quote, something like, if you were perfectly self-interested and enlightened, you would love everybody because you would see them not other than yourself. I think that it's almost kind of, you know, we're starting from in a modern society where we're all atomized and we need to go through this particular pathway where you need to almost find, you know, your love for people and the land, you know, through yourself, you know, like through some kind of awakening within yourself that then, you know, the ego can't attend its own funeral, right? So it suddenly, the ideal is that it's then suddenly, oh, this person is not fundamentally different from me, right? We're different expressions of, you know, universe or whatever, but they're not fundamentally different. And so how can I improve this relationship, right? To express that, you know, wholeness, or, you know, with our ecology, with the land, right? It seems like it should be a natural expression. And of course, you know, in traditional society, in indigenous cultures, they went the other way, right? Like the social cultural context was already there, right? The scaffolding was already there. And you almost started from the social, and then maybe somebody would go on like a hero's journey or something, you know, but the foundation of the kind of community embeddedness of the land was already there. And so it's interesting that we're kind of having to reverse engineer it in modernity. You know, I don't know where it will go because it's kind of fundamentally a new thing.
Yeah, I think that's really important to talk about. Is, you know, we talk about, you know, narcissism is a culture-bound pathology, right? In the West, everybody has levels of narcissism that are at a level of pathology, close to it, if you're embedded in the culture. And that's true. And most of us like roll our eyes and put a moral judgment on that because what a bunch of assholes. And we forget how extraordinarily painful narcissism is for the narcissist. Very difficult to empathize with, but it's extraordinarily painful. It's not self-love, it's self-hatred. It's a hatred of who you really are, and so you fixate on an image of yourself that isn't true, because that's the palliative. That's the drug you take to self-medicate for the pain of hating who you are. Hating the culture that you come from, hating the land that you're a part of, hating your body, hating your mind is a horrible disease. And it's culture bound. It's culture bound. So when we encourage people to self-care, like, you know, obviously you don't want to sell people spa packages and Monster Energy drink, but if people are going to do that, right? What self-care fundamentally is about is about it's using the vector of self-obsession, which most of us are plagued with a little too much of. I mean, not that human beings in a healthy culture are not also self-obsessed, or just a little bit more than everybody else, right? But if you use this as a vector, then what you're doing is you're teaching people to heal their relationships to themselves, to their true selves, and if you can help them be a little more kind and a little more compassionate, then that helps them be a little more honest. And then if you can be a little more honest, then maybe you can reveal a little more of who you are, and you can put down a little more of the image. And that's just a slow, tortured crawl out of the false self and into the truth that sometimes requires spa packages and Monster Energy drinks. And it's like, you know, I don't know if it requires it, but it's going to come with it, because capitalism, like, that's how it is. You know, somebody's going to figure out how to make money off of this thing. But I don't see another really viable path that doesn't start with that. But I do think there's some real wisdom in healing the relationship console. And when I say console, I mean, like, if you're in like Star Trek, you know, and the people have like all the buttons that they oh, you know, fix the flux capacitor. Oh no, the Weeble's blowing up or whatever, right? Like, you've got this console of stuff that you can do to fly your starship. And you've got this console of buttons and actions that you can use to relate to people. And the console is the one that is the relationship to the self. It's the ego. That's what the ego is. So if you transform the way that you relate to yourself, then you can't help but bring that relationship console into all of your other relationships, including like the one with the land, with your body, with other people. And then pretty soon, if that relationship console starts to get good enough, you start to realize like, oh, we've all got the same console. Like you start to like the environments start to become very visible. The connections and the bonds start to become very thick, and they start to become very palpable. And so anyway, I think it's the right vector. It's much maligned, because when it goes the wrong way and when it traps people from developing and from growing, then of course it's not a good thing. But I do think it's the best path we've got that I know of right now, for as far as like a mass idea or a meme that could help lots of people.
I love that. Jason, were you going to say something?
Well, I was thinking, so we've had conversations, so like there's kind of a distinction people make between spirituality and religion, and religion, tends to be more kind of the social, instantiation, community of like, the body of Christ, or, like it's in the world. And, people, it seems like there's been an interesting trend, like we talked about, the new atheism, and that's pretty much fizzled out. And now it seems like people are kind of taking two different tracks, right? They're moving towards this like new synthesis of personal spiritual exploration. And then people are getting together in communities, you have new religious, kind of institutions that are arising. And then you have people kind of going back, going trad, right? Like going back to tradition, right? Like we just interviewed a guy who, grew up atheist, and then he recently converted back to, Catholicism, or he converted to Catholicism. And there's definitely, I think in the Doomer Optimism space, we kind of have to see a bit of both, right? We see, there's a lot of like traditional Christians who are always that way or returned, or decided. And then there's the kind of the weirdos, I would place myself in the weirdo camp of like, I've done kind of, I've done the religious thing, I felt it, constraining in unnecessary ways, and I need something else. But personal spirituality, or even doing it with cool friends, will only take you so far. Like what about the religion of the future? Is the religion of the future re-inhabiting the religious traditions that have been around, and submitting ourselves to them, or evolving them from the inside, or is it developing something new? I'm curious how you see that landscape.
I mean, I think both could work. I think it's good to have lots of options because people are so different and need kind of different things. I have always been such a non-joiner that it feels more like my way to, I mean, are we ever creating something new? Maybe yes, maybe no. That's like a whole other thing I think we could talk about, but I feel like maybe I don't want to say creating something new. I feel like I have always needed to like discover things for myself, to learn them. I don't know why, but I've always felt like a very skeptical person in a way that feels really intrinsic to my nature. But who knows, maybe it was some of how I was nurtured too, but where for me, and then like what's traditional, right? Like I don't use the word pagan a lot, or I sometimes say I'm like a lowercase pagan, partly because I don't follow. There are kind of more, centralized is the wrong word, but there's sort of a pagan canon that rests on sort of a fake history, and that's fine. I think creating history can be important, but I'm not really a part of that paganism. I'm more, but is that traditional? That feels more traditional to me in some ways than like the Christian upbringing I had. So the word traditional or trad gets used in a lot of different ways. For me, and I'm a like back to the land person, there's something deeply spiritual about that. and about being part of a community that is bigger than me and bigger than humanity. And it's also like really a privilege to get to go back to the land and like own land, which is a whole other conversation. Like, what does it even mean to own land? It means the land owns me and teaches me about myself in the greater Sangha, like in the greater beyond human community. And I also felt when I lived in New York City, there was still, I called it city magic, but there was still like an emergent concert of all being together too, that I'm in a kind of tensionous place in me where I'm coming like back to nature, because I really missed that when I lived in a city. I'm coming back to nature to rediscover that. And it's letting me see all of the like worshipful cycles I was involved in a city too. And where I also want there to be space for that, because not everyone can leave the city and go to the land to discover like the cycles in which they're enmeshed, and the kind of Mahasangha, the like great community, the like nested communities that they're a part of. I feel like my thought isn't complete. I want to hear from some of you, but I might have more to say.
Gabe, do you have any thoughts on this?
I don't think so. Maybe. So, probably one of the people I'm closest to on Twitter, aside from Buhddi and you all here, is Ta'alumat, who is my other mystical dad Twitter counterpart. There's a few of us, but us two are particularly tight. And we talked about this a few weeks ago. We talked about it's sort of in the context of like the changes that are happening in our little corner of spiritual Twitter. We sort of happened upon some ideas about a kind of metamodern container for faith. And maybe this ties into what we were talking about earlier, but maybe there's sort of an understanding that the body does faith and that the body does religion, like humans do it. And a lot of times the question is not which one is right, but like, which one does your body do? Which one does your body, like, how does your body want to worship? How do you want to worship? And when you're quiet and everything else is out of the way, like, how do you commune with the infinite and with paradox and with, those things that we think of as divine? And I think it's perfectly acceptable for that to be Catholic or Muslim or any of the world's religions, or to be a super weirdo, wild-eyed mystic who just does it in their own way. If we could come up with some kind of, and I don't believe that all religions are true and pointing at the same thing, and that, like I'm not a naive syncretist. In some ways, a really good metaphor for this is sort of like religion is to spirituality as gender is to sex, right? Like there can be so many different ways to express this kind of essential thing about this thing that's like so deep at the core of who we are. I don't think there are very many containers out there that provide a holding and developing environment for someone to really find the spirituality that's right for them. And I could be wrong. Maybe the Unitarians do this, or maybe something like this already exists that I'm not aware of. But if there were a community that we thought of as a developmental environment that encouraged spiritual exploration and growth, and held space for periods of intense skepticism, it's held in the same way that your parents held space for you to be an asshole when you were a teenager, right? If we had a spiritual container that held space for you to be an asshole when you have your new atheist phase, like without being like you've blasphemed and you have to get out of the community and you're excommunicated and you're objectively wrong about this manifestation of God. It's like, not, which isn't to say, I'm not trying to say that I'm not trying to say nothing is true and that all truth is relative. It's not that. It's only that I think something that's very obvious is that people worship in different ways. And if there's some way that we can help someone find the truest expression of their connection to the divine, then I would love to be a part of that.
I love that. The way that I've approached this question has just been like general exploration to see, like what you're saying, Gabe, like what resonates with me. And I do think like I need some kind of people involved, like other people somehow, whatever capacity, like other people, whether it's like through some kind of ritual or some sort of practice. And like I've always loved the idea that maybe it's not even true, maybe I just made this up in my head, but like early Christianity involved like eating together and like acknowledging sins, as in like shitty things I've done to other people here sitting at this table. Like, I'm sorry that I like screwed up, and like, you know, I'm just going to acknowledge it, clear the air. And like, I love the idea of that as like a ritual. Feels so informal, but beautiful too at the same time. Like, this is something that happened. Like, I just want to say it out loud. I want you all to know that I did it, and I'm sorry. And like, this is confession. I love that. So things like that, where there's some kind of like, just Jason and I have spoken about this privately, but like this metamodern spirituality thing where you're like pulling from these heuristics, these containers, these rituals that can take lots of different forms, but you know, finding what resonates with you. I want to shift a little bit to talking about like some practical approaches. Like, okay, so somebody's listening to this conversation, they've not done almost any spiritual practice, or haven't thought about it deeply, are considering maybe going back to religion or like exploring spirituality more. Where to even get started? Like, how to even wrap your head around it? What would you guys say as people who help others, you know, through that journey? Bex, you want to go?
I think such a fundamental skill is one, recognizing that you're not your thoughts, and noticing how your thought process relates to your emotions, and particularly how your emotions express themselves in the body. I think that's pretty easy to train through like a guided meditation, and I think, you know, for me it was kind of revolutionary. Like I had been religious in other ways, you know, mystical, you know, had psychedelic experiences, but I didn't have that basic skill until I was like 30. And it was like a revolutionary, you know, realization that you could do this. It just completely changed everything. And, you know, I think just with that basic, you know, kind of ability, it opens up a whole range of exploration and affordances that you could do. So, you know, mindfulness 101, basically.
I sometimes like to call mindfulness bodyfulness. So there's me like swinging the pendulum, which doesn't mean not mindfulness. It just means I want like people to know it's maybe bigger than mind, or mind is more physical than it seems, or something. So what has worked practically for me, and so it ends up being kind of what I share with folks is, I mean, it could be in a sort of a container, like I guess the container I'm mostly coming from formally is yoga, but I'm in kind of a hinge point in my yoga teaching where I'm like becoming a somaticist. And so my yoga really has this sort of somatic foundation, which means being more about feeling than the formalism of yoga. But again, the formalism of the container of yoga, like making shapes, is still a good tool as long as we remember that the shapes are actually quite arbitrary, or they don't have meaning outside of the person making them, is what I really mean by that. And so my experience has been that my like what I call my spirituality arises in group movement, whether that's a yoga class or dancing together. And it might also mean the sharing or sound making or talking or that comes from that too. And I feel like the way I'd like to offer it in more and more diverse ways. I can kind of see that trajectory in my life. And right now it often looks like me developing an exercise for someone that would probably look like yoga or a more simple movement and breath that would be about like getting curious about feeling one's own body and anatomy.
I just have to jump in first before Gabe goes. What was coming up for me, Bex, when you were talking was I'm always trying to think like, how would these principles work if they were happening on a community scale? Because this is where my mind always goes. And I was thinking about like a town dance. Like a town dance, you know, everybody knows what happens at it. And like there are roles, and like, you know, traditionally I've heard of these stories where people have talked about how there's like the old ladies who sit on the side and they're like silently judging what everybody's doing, but in like a way that manages what people are allowed to do inside, you know, because you know that they're
the yoga container.
What do you say?
They're the yoga container.
They're the container like within which the activity can act, like can express itself. And like thinking about like a town dance where everybody in the town knows what movement to make. I was at a Native American dance once in Arizona with a friend who was doing field work there. And it was like, there was like this chicken scratch dance, like people danced like they were a chicken scratching the ground in a circle, like everybody was going around in a circle. And that was like such a cool container for like spirituality to arise out of. And then the other thing that I was thinking about was this sports team that I'm on. I've played sports a lot in my life, and I like sports classes more than dance classes for whatever reason, but I just feel like there's something in the competitive nature and then the limitations on the rules for the sport, but then like we have a goal, I'm trying to win. So that's really fun too, because you're trying to reach something, but then the whole time there's like, at least at the sports I've always played, there's a playfulness to it. Like I never really took it that seriously, which made it more fun for me, I think. But anyways, I was just thinking about those different examples of, you know, maybe even making music together as something to, as like
and I would say, yeah, as an addendum, it could be making music together after dinner, but it could be singing together as we work. Like it could be smiling at each other as we do a maypole, which we do a maypole, like a May Day celebration every year. So that's still kind of fresh in my mind, where we do a maypole and like do kind of a spiral dance and a few different practices, which are which we consider traditional, but we're also kind of reinventing from what we know about them. And there's such a like the sweetest, sort of most mischievous, like winky ground of being just seems to like be like, hi, as you're like going around the maypole together. I don't know, there's like something deep about life that I cannot describe any better than this, that comes up. And like I'm trying to remember. Yesterday I just listened to the episode with Rich, and like trying to remember how he defined conviviality, which is a word I like to use a lot, but something about just like liveliness.
Yep, totally.
Yeah.
Illichian. I'm getting more and more into Illich. Gabe, you could go. Sorry.
I'm really glad you brought up viviality, or the feeling of aliveness, because that was going to be part of what I wanted to talk about. But if someone was just getting started on a spiritual journey, I've been doing life coaching, and I have the privilege of seeing the outset of people's spiritual journeys. A lot of times they're dipping their toe in by talking to a life coach, because that seems like the most sort of respectable thing You don't want to just go straight to hippie, like 0 to like hippie, you know, like that's hard. Um, but I think that um, I certainly don't think you need a life coach or a teacher or a therapist or a mentor. Um, I don't think everyone needs that. I think some people really benefit from that. I would say if you have at least one person that you can talk to about spirituality and about the noumenal and about sort of, you know, the unseen and what you believe and what you think is going on, whether that's a partner or a friend or a family member. I do believe that this is a process that has to happen in dialogue because we're dialogic creatures. And so we have to develop in solitude and we have to develop in dialogue. And both of those things need to happen. And it will be and Buhddi will recognize this motion, but the fundamental motion of it is evolutionary, and it'll be it's embeddedness, and then it's differentiation, and then it's integration and embeddedness, and then it's differentiation, right? And this is the motion of life. This is from the minute you're attached to a uterine wall and swimming in amniotic fluid until all of a sudden you're outside taking your first breath and everything is light and pain, right? And this is the motion of life, right? Differentiation, integration. If you're going to begin a spiritual journey, understand that that's going to be the motion, and make sure you have someone that you can just be honest with, even about the really weird stuff that you might experience, or the really like magical things that you might believe that might sound a little crazy to somebody else. And then I would say carve out a little piece of time every week that's quiet, and take some time to explore your relationships. And I don't mean necessarily to other people, but you can start there. And whether it's journaling or you make art or music or something, a period of time that's dedicated, that's just for you, and that's quiet and away from everything else. You can really kind of leave everything at the door, and then start asking questions. What is my relationship to my spirit? What is my relationship to my body? And then that's going to bring up lots of other questions. What's my relationship to my mind? What's my relationship to my food? What's my relationship to my home? What's my relationship to my community? And just keep looking at relationships, and just keep looking at not the what, but the how. How do you relate to these things? How would you characterize the way that you relate to everything in your life? And just see what happens. Just keep expressing, just keep writing down, and see for yourself what feels true and what fills you with a sense of aliveness.
I would add, what is my relationship with I, me, mine? This story.
They'll get there.
Self-inquiry. Yeah.
I think that's a natural outcropping. I think it's like when you start getting really good at this stuff, all of a sudden you're like, wait a minute. Yeah. Like, what's my relationship to myself? Uh-oh. And that's where the really good stuff starts happening. Sorry, go ahead.
No, yeah, I think you just said it. I guess the thing I would add, I mean, the second thing I found revolutionary for me was turning the light back around. Because like even in, say, Vipassana meditation, you're like noting things, or your body scanning, or whatever process you're doing, but it's still from the perspective of somebody. You're noticing your body, and at a certain point you can turn the light around, and it's like, who is the I that's noticing? And for me, something I found really helpful was relating this back to the body, of like, if I do an inquiry like, what is aware, then I can notice the body sensations that light up from that question, right? So it's not just kind of like what is aware and then hopefully something mystical happens. It's more like, what is aware? Oh, actually I noticed that the sense of awareness is like behind the eyes, or it's in the shoulders, right? And then you can kind of relate it to this more somatic process. Or, you know, who am I in relationship to this person, right? Like, so you can also, you know, not to get too narcissistic, it can also, you know, it starts to wind its way around all of your kind of identities in relationship to yourself and other people. Why do you want to do this? Because it might be overly fixated on a restrictive notion of the identity of yourself or the identity of yourself in relationship. And by, you know, loosening up that fixation, I think it frees you up to improve, right? To refactor.
I just have one last, like, even mini prompt. So we talked a little bit in our little group chat about Doomer and optimism being these two poles. So I'm wondering if you guys have some thoughts. I think for a lot of people, like, they're stuck in this, they can feel stuck in this doom place. So specific, and for other people, maybe they don't even look at the doom and they just go like straight to whatever, Mars or whatever that will place that's like optimistic in their head. So I'm wondering if you guys have thoughts about this meme specifically, you know, the tension between these two poles. Make Gabe go first.
I have some ideas.
Okay, you go first this time.
I think that I think it's a fruitful paradox. I think it's a useful thing. I'm recalling a line from John Michael Greer's book. I think it was Dark Age America, and he talks about how when empires decline, things actually get better for lower class people in a lot of ways, because wealth starts to redistribute, and you know, and that may not be the same, obviously, in this day and age, because there's a much less of a connection to the land and much less of, you know, skills to take care of yourself. But I do think there are I think there are reasons to be optimistic despite despite having accepted that we're in this this crash course with disaster that's, you know, it's kind of slow motion train wreck that we're in. Contrasting the two of these, to me the synthesis of these two is one you all have already arrived at, which is effectiveness, which is saying, okay, like, this is happening, right? And it's making me think of a children's cartoon. It's Avatar: The Last Airbender. Do you guys know this cartoon?
Yeah.
All right. I watched this with my son. It was a show on Nickelodeon a couple 10, 15 years ago. And there's this character, Uncle Iroh, who's this like kind of old sage guy. And at one point he gets put in prison. And the whole time he's in prison, he acts crazy whenever the prison guard is around. And whenever the prison guard leaves, he just works out and just gets jacked. And then the minute there's an opportunity to escape, he's ready. And I think the Uncle Iroh principle that's really important is, like, just because an opportunity has not yet presented itself for us to possibly fix some aspect of the meta crisis, like, just because we can't see it doesn't mean that it's not coming, or doesn't mean that, you know, but if it presents itself, we better be prepared. And even more than that, by preparing and becoming stronger, that itself affects your ability to see opportunities. So it's, in a way, right, those opportunities may not come until you get stronger, like until you become more effective. And so I would say that's the optimism part. It's like, yeah, it all looks like doom and gloom right now, but maybe that's because we need to work out. You know, we need to improve ourselves. There you go. We need to be more effective. We need to learn skills, and we need to learn how to do more with less, and you know, repair our relationships to our communities, repair our relationships to the land in as much as we can, learn how to actually take care of ourselves in ways that we use to receive care from community and ways that we use to receive care from developmental environments that no longer hold for us any longer. And you know, I think there's a lot of fruitful work in that paradox. Yeah, I have more to say, but it's a little bit off on a tangent, and I want to give Buhddi a chance to talk. So.
Well, I love what you say about paradox. And I think, you know, I really value that too, kind of in everything. I feel like I often avoid talking about what, like, capital T truth, or I think I still have some skepticism around that because of how subjective it all is. And I'm also not a pure relativist, but I feel that when we get into like paradox, we're starting to get closer to something that's probably truth, because it's so big and immense and whole that like we can't hold it all at once, and so it feels like paradox. So I think there's a really important tension in paradoxes, and and that's like like holding the importance of paradox is a deeply sort of spiritual practice for me. And so I really like the tension in the term Doomer Optimism, and I think it's really catchy. You came up with it, right, Jason?
Ashley coined the term.
Yeah.
That's
it was us like in conversation with one another, but I was he used the word separate and I put them together.
Right on. That's how the best things arise in community like that, right? Like it's I like in my marriage, like we often argue about who came up with what term or whatever, which say again?
I love that you have your own terms.
Yeah, no, we have a lot of our own terms, and like, well, I'm often like, oh yeah, the thing I came up with, and he'll be like, babe, I came up with that. I'm like, oh, you did? No, I did. And really the truth of it is a lot of it came up in generative conversation. And I think that like that we are all generally better that way in like sharing and seeing what arises emergently. And so, but I'm kind of getting far, maybe a little bit afield. Yeah, I really think there's something in like preparing for the worst and not being so optimistic. We ignore signs that things are changing and like trust that we'll be taken care of somehow without taking it upon ourselves to do that, I think. But to not get like lost in the crushingness of it and give up and like kind of give into depression or gloom or cruelty or numbness. I think like it is a practice to hold that balance and we have a responsibility to flex our ability to respond, which is how I would kind of say like what you were saying, Gabe.
All right.
So I'm glad you said.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Gabe.
Oh, I was gonna say I'm really glad you said that. That's related to where I wanted to take it.
Yeah, I want to hear this tangent.
Which is, it's related to what Jason said. It's related to what Buhddi said. Something that's really important. It's something that paradox shows us is that what we think about something is not what it is. Right, the finger pointing at the moon is not the moon. Like what your attitude towards something determines how you relate to it, but it doesn't say it's not the thing itself. And so if you can learn to name your doomer thoughts whenever they come up, there's the doomer, right? And you can learn to pair that every time with like, when the doomer comes up, what's the first thing you do? Because for a long time I reached for my phone because I was like, how I'm gonna, just like, you know, like that's how I'm gonna make myself feel better about the fact that everything's going to shit. But if you can learn to see the category of thoughts that, or whatever the piece of you inside of you that is focused on the doom, And whenever that comes up and you can learn to use that energy, you can train yourself, little butterscotch candies or whatever works. Every time the doomer comes up, how do I go get productive with that anxiety? How do I, it's like, oh shit, like I'm worried about things, going to hell. Well, instead of freaking out about it, I'm gonna send a message out to the group chat, and I'm gonna say, who wants to like come over for dinner, and we're gonna learn tying some new knots. Like we're gonna need knots if shit goes to, if things go to shit. Like this, you need to know how to do that. It's an important skill, right? So whatever it is, right? It's like if you can channel that anxiety into, first, if you can name it, and then if you can learn how to channel it, I think that you can shrink it, right? And you can actually see the doom much more clearly, but you can see it standing up with shoulders back, and you can look it right in the eye, and I it's like, it's coming. It's not a question of whether it's coming, right? The question is whether it's like, how are you going to meet it? And I think that's the key. And I think that's what I would tell anyone who's kind of suffering under a blanket of doom right now, is like, start channeling it into whatever way you can, and start small and be okay with it going slow.
Can I add something to that? I'm curious if you
agree. Of course.
Channel it, but don't escape it, right? So the feelings of doom is closely related to the fear of death, and we have to come to terms with death. And so there's kind of almost like a pivot where you come to terms with your own death, right? It frees you up from being reactive away from it, but it's still there. And then you can respond to it by channeling it. And if you agree with that, then I
100% agree with that. Yeah, that's wonderful. Yeah.
I love the cognitive behavioral aspect, Gabe. That's so cool. The butterscotch, like whatever it is, like just forcing yourself into new habits. That's like, that's so cool. I love that so much. And it's so practical, which I love too.
Just important to be careful with it, because you can hack yourself into things that are false. You can hack yourself into things that are ego driven or that are not good for you, and you can really get lost. And so it's a technology. I mean, that's just, you just want to exercise great caution and make sure it's always coming from a place of love, and like, I want to build habits that are leading me to a self that has a greater truth value than my current self, right? Like I can live in more truth. I can accept more truth. When you're using behavioral modification to get yourself toward that, then it's a wonderful tool. And if you're using it to run away from something, you can really cause some problems. So just a caveat I want to put out there.
Awesome. This was so great. We're probably all itching to go become embodied again. So I'll just like wrap this up here. Any last thoughts from anybody before we finish? This was so good, insanely good. I'm so happy with this conversation. Final thoughts?
I just want to say
I feel really grateful to you. Thank you. That's it.
I love having you guys on. Both of you are two of my favorite accounts, and so it's delightful to have you here. So thank you for coming on.
Yeah, no, thank you for having us. It's been so fun. And I think my final thought is something like the dynamic tension between any poles is like relationship, and then like in the real world, then that looks like growing your community. And I'm really grateful to be doing that with you all right now.
Oh, that's so good. That's such a great place to end it. Okay. I've got to pee again because I've just been drinking mate constantly. So
I thought that was mate.
Yeah, I'm gonna let you guys go. But this was so beautiful. Thank you so much.
Bye,
Happy all so much.
Happy